Hello and welcome to another video tutorial from Blender HD. My name is Jonathan Lampelt, and in this video we're going to create this cute little snowman. Starting out in Blender, we're just going to start out with the default cube. I'll provide the link to the file on my website. You can get that in the description below. It's not going to have all of the background or textures just because I used a couple third-party textures, also the grass essentials in the background. So just to be safe, I'm going to just give you the snowman character, but you can download that and use it for whatever you want. Okay, so starting out, I'm going to delete the default cube, and it seems like a pretty good start to add a sphere. So that's going to be our first step. Now let's tab into edit mode and Shift D to duplicate this sphere, and this part's going to be the head. But instead of just sort of cramming these two on top of each other, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of these vertices right in the middle here that are intersecting and go ahead and delete those. Next, I can Alt select and then Alt Shift select these two right here, and then W loop tools and bridge. Okay, then I'm going to press Control R, scale this in, and this just gives us a nice little bridge from the base of the body up through the head, so it's not sort of intersecting. It'll give us a nice smooth flow. Maybe scale this one up just a little bit, and there we go. Looks like we're off to a good start. So let's add a subdivision surface modifier. They crank that up to 2 and shade smooth. So here's the base of our snowman. However, we're going to need a lot of little bumps on the surface to make it not look so smooth. So let's add a displacement modifier really quick and add a new texture over here in the textures panel over there. Let's just go to clouds, and this is going to be our large detail. So let's increase the size to say, let's go 1.25. So we have a nice lump, and depending on how large you want it, you will want this more or less lumpy. Let's try a good 0.5. Maybe that's after it's melted a bit too much. Let's go 0.3. Okay, so we have our nice little lump, because this is going to be a tiny snowman, very cute, and we don't want it to be too perfectly round. So here we have our nice lump. However, we're going to need some more fine details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another displacement modifier, add another texture, but over here, if we choose displace texture 0, 1, I'm going to change this to image or movie. Now, the image texture that I'm going to use is, I think I got it off CG Textures, but it's pretty much just a grunge texture, where you can see it has a whole bunch of scratches and scrapes. So you can kind of see it there. It's just a whole bunch of scrapes and stuff, and that kind of helps simulate the look of either somebody scraping away the snow as they're building the snowman, and also sort of some dots and whatever as it's melting in different places. So something like this is a good start to the texture. You don't want it to be too round and fluffy like the original noise. We want it to be a little bit sharper. Okay, so here we have it. Of course, that is much too strong. So let's go ahead and turn down the strength to 0.5. But as you'll notice that these things are actually pointed outwards. Maybe we can see it a bit better if we increase this a bit. So you can see we have all of these things poking outward, but instead, since this is snow and it's going to be melting, they're actually going to be wanting to be poking inwards instead. So let's go negative 0.1. Take a look at that. And that's on the right path, but as you can see, it's lots of stretching and we don't really want that. So let's change the texture coordinates from local to UV. But we don't have a UV map quite yet, so let's split this window, change this to the UV image editor, and load up that texture. Go into edit mode, and now I'm just going to take, let's see, on the back, I'm going to take this edge loop right here, go to shading in the toolbar and mark seam. Then I think I can also mark a seam around the neck because we're going to use a scarf, so that'll be pretty well hidden. I'll mark that seam, select everything, U, and unwrap. So it doesn't have to be completely perfect as long as it's not as stretched, and it's looking like that is pretty good. So there we have our smaller texture. However, I found when I was playing with this that we'll definitely want a lot of this smaller texture detail, so I'm going to increase the view to 5 just to see how it looks. And it looks like that is about right, so let's change the render to 5 as well. And we can also change the strength to -0.25 because we're going to add a lot of subsurface scattering, and so we're definitely going to need a good amount of detail to be able to tell that it's even there. So it looks like I'm not quite happy with how that is. It's a little bit too sharp and pointed in those areas. So let's go back to our texture here. And I'm not quite happy with how this turned out. So let's add a few more seams. Maybe we can add one around where the hat is going to be, and also one below the ground that we're not going to see in the first place. So that looks like it'd be around here. Mark seam, select everything U and unwrap. And then UVs we can pack islands. Okay, so let's see how that looks. Alright, I think that's looking much better. And of course, if this is still too small scale detail, you can just go in edit mode and scale these individual pieces up. Especially if you have a tiled texture, but this one is not tiled, so unfortunately I can't do that very well. Okay, so here we have our nice small details. Let's go ahead and add a shader to this real quick. Let's go to the node editor, material nodes, and add a new material. And you can see in rendered view we have sort of what looks like a plaster wall or something. So let's just change this from a diffuse to a subsurface scattering because we want the light to be scattering inside of this like it would in an actual snowball. So let's just press Shift S on the diffuse, switch to shader and subsurface scattering. And you can play around with the scale depending on how large you want your snowball to be. So 0 is going to be very much like our original diffuse shader. 1 is going to be very, very small. I found somewhere around 0.3 is about right, but you can play around with it and see exactly what works best in your scene. Okay, so now that we have our snow, it's looking fairly decent. However, it's not entirely accurate because we want snow to be a little bit shiny. We want all those tiny little bumps. So what we're going to do is actually mix this with a glossy node. So shader, mix shader, Shift A, shader, and glossy. Let's plug this in the bottom. And if we have a look at this, let's turn this down to 0.01. So it's going to be very, very shiny. But there's nothing for it to really reflect. It doesn't look very good. So I'm going to add a HDR background here. Just choose an environment texture. And that's going to help us see our reflections a little bit better and see exactly what we're going for. So I'll turn the strength up to 2. Okay, so now when we take a look at our mix shader here, we can a little bit better see what we have going on. However, we don't really want it to be completely shiny all the way around. We definitely want this to be based on the Fresnel value because it's going to be more glossy the more of a grazing angle that we are seeing it at. So let's go ahead and add input and layer weight. Here we see we have the Fresnel value, and 0.5 is pretty good. You can definitely play around with it. The lower that you set this, the more subsurface scattering that you're going to be, and the higher that you set this, the more of the glossy you're going to see. So maybe 0.5 is pretty decent. Let's take a look through the camera and press Shift B to create a little box, and that way it's going to render faster around those edges, and we can see exactly what's going on. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. You can see around here on the edges we have the nice crystal look going on with all the little sharp edges, and I'd say this is looking pretty good. So one last thing that I'm going to do is add a little bit more fine detail for the bump, just in case, because if you see, we look at the glossy, it's looking nice, but we can add a little bit more detail if we want to. So I'm going to just add another texture and noise texture. And we can Control Shift click to see exactly what this looks like. I'm going to set the scale something really high, say 100, let's go 200. Okay, so 200. And then I'm going to take this and plug the factor into the displacement right there. So we're taking a look at the glossy, we can see we have a ton of fine detail. However, it's much too strong. So let's take a color hue saturation value node and turn down the value to 0.2. Okay, so now we have even more detail in there, and as we take a look, we now have something that looks really convincing, like a small ball of snow. And that's especially cool since we're plugging this into the displacement, it's also going to work on the Fresnel. Let's go ahead and have this sit on something. So let's add a plane. This is going to be our ground. I recommend adding a nice little background. I had him sitting on some stairs in my image. That definitely helps add a little bit more interest to the scene. Okay, so now what we're going to do is tilt him back just a tad. Also turn off all of that so we don't have to see it. Okay, things will run a bit more smooth now. So I'm going to tilt this back just a little bit because it seemed like he was a lot more cute once I tilted him back. Just because he's looking up and has those big eyes, so that just kind of helped the whole look of it. But I definitely want a little squished portion around the edges so that he doesn't just cut into the ground. We want him to sort of blend in like he'd been smushed there. So let's take this edge loop right here, rotate it a bit, this one as well. Maybe scale it up to keep the spherical shape. I'm going to press S, Z, and 0 to scale 0 on the Z axis. Scale that up a bit. Okay, so now what I can do is I can take this and I can just scale it up just like that. And if I need to, I can add another edge loop, or maybe grab this one and make sure it's not quite so abrupt. Scale it in just like that. So he's sort of blending into the sidewalk there. So now if we take a look at the displacement, we now have this nice little pile that he's sitting in. Okay, so that is looking good. Let's go ahead and add the other objects. I'm going to shift space so I can only see the 3D view to give me a bit more room to work. Shift A, let's add the nose. Sounds like a good thing to do. Let's give this guy a nose, so I'm going to add a cone. Rotate this around. Scale it down, put it right in front of his face. Okay, so this is going to be his nose. And since this is a tiny cute snowman, we definitely want it to be sort of a baby carrot. So let's make sure that it's a nice sort of rounded corner. We don't want it to taper too soon. And we can press E to extrude and extrude that back into his face. Now, before I deselect that, I'm going to just hit delete and delete those faces. So that way when we add the subdivision surface modifier, it's not going to try to blend those in and come out of the face. Maybe I'll scale these down just a little bit more. Okay, so let's see how that looks with a subsurf. Okay, maybe that's too big of a beak. Alright, let's go with that, and I'll maybe twist it just a tad, just to add some personality to it. Better up or down? Let's go down on this one. Alright, so we have our little carrot beak, and we can add a material for that too as well. I'm actually going to take this snow material, let's name it snow so we know which one it is. But I'm going to press this little 2, and that's going to create a duplicate user of it so I can change it any way that I want, and it won't affect our snowman here. And I'm going to rename this to carrot. Now I can delete these textures down here because we don't want that tiny little bump detail. Let's set our camera somewhere around here with Control-Alt numpad 0. And I can Shift B, select that area so I'm just looking at the carrot. Okay, so carrots are definitely orange, and we want some subsurface scattering to keep this nice and small looking. So let's make this more orange. And also we don't want quite so much reflection, so let's turn this down to about 0.1, maybe 0.2, and also increase the roughness to about 0.1. So there we have our carrot. Now, it's not quite as small as that. We don't want as much scattering since the carrot's going to be much harder than the snow. Let's go ahead and increase this to 0.5. Now, in my final image, I actually added a bunch of scratches to my carrot with the texture. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So I'm going to add a texture, image texture, and I just chose one with a bunch of scratches on it. If we take a look, it's not seeing anything. However, we can go to Input, Texture Coordinate, Generated, and change this from flat to box. So now we have a whole bunch of scratches. Let's add a vector and mapping node, because I want the scratches to be a bit bigger so we can see them a bit more easily. So let's take this first one, click and hold down all of these, and then shift, and then we can now just scale these up fairly easily. Wrong way. Let's go about there. Okay. So here we have our scratches. I can Shift A, add a mix RGB, use this as the factor. First color we want to be orange. Whoops. So let's take the color picker, pick our original carrot color, and also I'm going to mix that with white. Get those carrot scratches, plug that into the subsurface scattering, and there we have a little bit better looking carrot. Alright. So now that we have a carrot, what else do we need to add? We need to add buttons for the eyes, we need to add a top hat, and we also need to add a scarf, and then we should be good to go. This is a fairly simple process, but each little object has their own little tricks, so I hope you find it somewhat interesting. Okay, so let's add another circle. Let's just make the hat really quick. It's pretty easy. We're just going to add a circle, go into edit mode, rotate it around, get the brim of his hat kind of poking up a little bit. Now we can E to extrude, scale that down so it's just fitting around his head. Then let's extrude again, pull that up to make a nice little top hat. Oh, looks like we need to scale it up just a little bit more. Okay, E to extrude one more time, scale that down. And then I'll just press F to fill that in. And since it's not going to be animated, I'm just going to leave that as an N-gon. Here, what we can do to this hat now is add a subdivision surface modifier, sort of smooth that out. And if you want to keep those sharp edges, we can just press Ctrl R, add those edge loops in there, like so. Change that to smooth shading, and maybe place it on his head a little bit better. That's a bit more snug. Now it looks like the displacement modifier does make it a little bit tricky to put a perfect circle on here. Well, that's okay. Let's put it farther in on his head, even though it cuts through. And what we can do is go into edit mode, use proportional editing, and sort of pull those areas out just a little bit until they're no longer intersecting like so. And I'm also going to take some of these edges and move them down, move them up, to give a little bit of floppiness to his hat, so it's not quite so perfectly stiff and straight. Okay, so you can also see that the normals are not facing in the right direction, and that happens a lot when you're dealing with circles. So let's go ahead and go down to shading in our toolbar, and just recalculate the normals, or flip direction if that doesn't work, and there we go. Now the last thing I want to do is not make this so paper thin. We need to add a little bit of thickness to this. So let's just add a solidify modifier, thickness of maybe 0.02, and now we have our hat. Very cool. Before we add the shader to that, let's add some of the other objects as well, and then we can finish up the shading at the very end. So let's add the sticks for the arms. So I'm going to add a cube to make his arms. I'm going to tab into edit mode, and then I'm actually going to delete all of the vertices right off the bat. Because what I can now do is control click and place a vertex anywhere I want. And so I'm going to control click and just sort of place vertices like that, and then delete them if I need to. Now I can select one of these, maybe E to extrude, and we're just going to make it look like sort of a branch hand. Okay, so once we have our branch shaped exactly as you want, you might want to take a little bit more time to make it a bit more pretty than that. Once we have that, we can add a skin modifier, and that's going to add our geometry around the vertices. Now if I tab into edit mode, I can take all of these, press Ctrl A, scale that down, something a bit more natural. Then I can take these tips right here, Ctrl A on those, scale those down to little points. until we have something that looks a bit better. Okay, now I can also move these along another axis, along the y-axis, so it's also not quite so stiff. And there we have our little hands. So let's also add a subdivision surface modifier to this. Shade that to be, I guess we need check smooth shading there in the skin modifier. And there we have it. Maybe I'll pull that in just a little bit. I'll do that in edit mode so we can have the origin still be at the center. And then to create the left hand, I'm just going to take this one, Shift D to duplicate it, Control M on the x-axis, and there we have our second set of arms. Now if I tab into edit mode, I can just adjust these to make it look slightly different. You might want to make a completely new one if you're going for a more natural look, but it's pretty easy just to, extrude a new segment, Control A to scale it down, all that good stuff. So really quickly you can make your nice branches. Let's see, maybe we want to rotate it a bit on that axis. All right, let's call it good. So here we have our nice little stick arms poking out. Looks like he's ready to give you a nice big hug. All right, so last things is scarf and buttons. Let's go ahead and make the buttons. I'm going to jump to a new layer just so we can have an empty space to work with. And I'm going to add a circle. Now this circle, I want to have 16 segments. And the reason we're going to have 16 segments is that we can now add another circle right inside of it in edit mode. And this one I want to have 8 segments. And so the reason for this is that if I take one of these little guys here and put it over here, Shift D, duplicate it, and just make a few circles in the middle, 16 and 8 will all connect to each other evenly. So if you add the wrong number of vertices and they don't quite work with each other, then it'll be a lot harder to make. But with 16 on the outside and 8 for each of these, it works out quite nicely. So now I can just go ahead and start filling in these faces here. We're just filling in faces, so I'll speed this up so you don't get too bored. Or just box selecting and pressing F to fill these in. Alright, once we have all of those done, let's just add an edge loop right through the middle of all of these, and that way we can fill these in as well. Alright, here we have our button. Looks like it's not quite even, so let's select all of this, put it in a little closer to the center, and there we go. So to finish this off, let's add a solidify modifier. We can also add a subdivision surface modifier to smooth that out. However, we can put that on top of this one. Let's see, and then we can also add a bevel modifier. Sort of bevel the edges, but we don't want to bevel these edges down here. We only want to bevel around the wide, or the very outside rim. So instead of choosing this based on no limit, we're going to base it on the angle, and only things greater than 30 degrees will be beveled. So all of these tiny little ones will not, but those will. Now if I set this to smooth shading, auto smooth over here in the object data panel, turn this down to say 25 degrees. There we have our edges smoothed over here, but not where we don't want them to be on top. And then the rim. Okay, so here we have our nice button. Let's move that on to the first layer. And we can take that and start placing it. So this first one, let's just scale it down and put it right on his stomach here. It's good to stick it in just a little bit so it's looks like it's pushed into the snow, like someone kind of pushed it in with their finger rather than just floating there in midair. Yeah, it's a little bit big. Let's scale it down just a tad. Maybe I want the top one to be about there, so maybe I have to move the bottom one down like so and make room for a third button. And there we go. Okay, now what we can do is make eyes with these same buttons, so let's duplicate that up, rotate that around. This camera's in the way, so let's hide that. And you'll notice we'll need to rotate it a bit on the Z-axis so that it fits in with that circle. Duplicate it, rotate it again on the Z, pull it out just a little bit, and there we have our eyes. Okay, so it's looking pretty good, but they're all sort of facing the same direction, and any sort of uniformity in CG definitely makes things look a little bit fake and contrived. So let's add a little bit of randomness to them by switching the transform orientation to local and setting this to the rotation widget so we can just easily grab these, rotate them around so they're not quite so uniform. All right, now we can add a material to these. I'm just going to name it button and add this really quick. So viewport color, make it dark gray so we can tell which one it is. Let's see, and in rendered view, we can't see it. Okay, I'll just switch this from a diffuse, Shift S, shader, and glossy. I'll just make this a really dark gray glossy with maybe 0.1 roughness. Alright, so that's going to be our button. Pretty simple. But what I can do is now select all of these other buttons, then select this last one here. And on the material panel, you have this little arrow here, and I can click that and copy material to others. And now all of the other buttons will have our nice button material. Alright, so the last thing that we're going to do is add the scarf. This one I tried a few different ways. Originally I tried the cloth like physics modifier to see if I could make it wrap around all nice and natural, but it ended up being more frustrating than it was worth. I also tried using curves. That didn't work too well either. So the fastest way to do this is actually just add a circle. So I wanted to add a nice knot to it, sort of like the way I would tie my own scarf. So let's put this around his neck. And we want to make this a fairly large scarf because we want him to look really small and cute. So everything is a little bit oversized, like a little kid wearing a bunch of baggy clothes. So making everything a bit larger is going to make him look a bit smaller. So let's take this and scale it in a bit. I'm going to select everything, Control N, just to reverse the normals, fix those. Pull this back a bit. Remember, he's tilted, so let's tilt that back. Scale it up just a bit. Alright. That looks like a good start. Now what we can do is take this face right here, and I'm going to delete it. I'll just delete that face, then select everything. Well, actually, before we do that, let's take this one, extrude down and sort of over his belly here. And if we rotate this from the side view as well, we can make it look like it's sitting on top of him. Okay, so that's one side of his scarf just sort of falling down. Now we can take everything, Shift D. I'm going to scale it up a bit, just like so. Now what I can do is take these two edges right here, get a better angle. I'm going to extrude them down and rotate them so it's actually going to cover these right here. So I can pull this first one, make it go above, and the second one's going to go below. and this is going to form the knot, so that I can select both of these, F to fill, and there we have our nice scarf knot. Maybe I can take these, pull them in a bit closer. Maybe pull that out a little bit. And so that's going to be the very basics of our scarf. So we need a little bit more detail, so it's not quite so straight. Let's add some subsurf to this, just to see how it looks. So we want it nice and smooth. So it looks like a good start, but we definitely need to make a few changes. So first of all, let's add an edge loop right down the middle. And you see that since it's all connected, it's going to add that over both the inside and the outside of the scarf. So let's go ahead and deselect all of these areas down here. So I want to pull this scarf in just like that, sort of around the middle. Then with these, I can pull these out and make a nice little bulge for the knot. You can shade smooth as well. Looks like we need to recalculate the normals again, so let's press everything, Control N. Looks like it inverted it, calculated it the wrong way, so let's flip direction in the toolbar. And there we go. Almost looks a little bit better if some of these are pulled outwards instead of inwards. So let's try that for a few. Okay, so here we have it. Let's add another edge loop right around here to help that knot out a bit. And if you want these edges to be a bit more straight, add another edge loop to those. And there we have our scarf. So let's add a solidify modifier to that as well. Pull that up. And it looks like we need to now take that and adjust our knot a bit more. And you can spend a little while tweaking all this, but I think I'm going to let that sit for now. One thing that I did in my final was add some hair to this. And you can just do that with the hair particle system. But that's just a little minor detail. It doesn't take too long. I guess let's just add it to the ends, and then if you want to add it to the rest of the scarf, you can do so. So let's enable proportional editing here. And if we choose connected, it'll move one end of the scarf without moving the other. And that way we can take this and sort of drag it to another area. And that's going to make it look a bit more natural, so it's not directly in the same spot. Okay, so about that hair, let's select these faces right on the end here. Shift D to duplicate them, P and separate by selection. And now we have a spot that's just those faces. And I can delete the solidify modifier because we won't need those. Now let's see if we can, if we use the normal transform orientation, maybe we can rotate these along the normal, because we want the hair to come out, and it's going to come out the normal of the face, and we want the strands to sort of face this way. So we're rotating this face so it'll be facing in the correct direction. Let's do that to this as well. Okay, close enough. Okay, so we have our little faces there, and what we can do in the Particles tab, add a new particle system, change that to hair, and wow, it looks like there's, this one, for instance, is going in the wrong direction. So let's just select all of this and flip direction. Okay, so now they're going in the right direction, but they're definitely huge. So let's change the hair length down very, very small. Let's go 0.2 about. And we can fine tune exactly how we want the rotation of these. So let's rotate them a little bit more. Okay, that looks looking better. have nice hairs for our scarf. Now, if we want to render this in cycles, we're going to have to enable cycles hair rendering, which it should be on by default. And we can take a look in rendered view, see what it is like. So right now it's just using this original material from a scarf, which is a good thing, that's what we want. However, it's much too small, looks sort of like horse hair or something. But we want a lot less of them, and we want them to be more thick, because remember, we want our snowman to look very small, and so everything else is going to look very big, and so a strand of this scarf is going to be fairly large. So let's turn this number down to something a bit more manageable, say 50. There's going to be quite a few less. Actually, let's go even lower, let's go 30. And then with the cycles hair settings, let's make it less pointy, because if you think about a string of yarn, it's not really pointy. So let's change the tip size to be 1 as well. You can even change this to be a bit bigger, maybe even at 2. Let's go with that. And we also don't want them to be quite so straight. So let's go into children and choose interpolated. However, we don't actually want there to be more of these strings, so let's just change this to be 1. So it's going to be the exact same number, but what this allows us to do is use some of these roughness and kink settings. So for instance, we can increase the endpoint roughness, increase the uniform roughness, maybe add some curl if we wanted to, just to mix things up a bit. And that way we don't actually have to add any more particles, but we get all of these extra properties that we can use. So, looking good. I notice in the render view that this is overlapping, so let's pull that up really quick. Alright, there we have our scarf. Let's finish this up by adding a bit more materials and seeing how it looks. Okay, so first of all, the scarf. I'm going to take the carrot material, make a second user for that, and just name this scarf, because we don't actually want it to look like a carrot. So let's delete that, but we do want some subsurface scattering. But instead of orange, you can make this whatever color you want. I'm going to use a cloth texture. So again, you can find something like this on CG textures, wherever. I forgot where I got this one. It must have been some sort of like promotional thing, I'm not sure. But it's a nice pattern. So of course we need to unwrap this in order to get it to work well. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to UV image editor, open up our cloth material. It looks like some sort of nice sock knitted material, and if we select all of this and just U and unwrap, we're going to get this sort of nasty pattern, and we want the sort of knitted pattern to follow along with this instead of sort of waving and stretching. So what we're going to do is select one of these edges right on one of these quads right on the edge. And when I press U, I'm going to follow active quads. And so that's going to give us a kind of a weird result at first. However, if we select this and rotate it a bit, select this one, rotate that as well, then we can much more easily get a nice straight result. So once it's pretty close to straight, we can just select all one row and then just align Y, W, align Y, and they should be about even. So let's pull it up like that, and there we have it. So if we look in textured view, we can see exactly how big the knit is. Let's pull it up to be something a bit more manageable like that. That's looking pretty good. Now you can add a displacement texture to this if you want to get those actual little bumps in the material itself, but for the most part I don't think it's completely necessary, so I'm going to skip doing that. Alright, so here we have our texture. We can plug that into the subsurface scattering. That's looking pretty good. However, we don't really want it to be mixed with glossy for our Fresnel, but we can actually mix this with a regular diffuse and get a nicer result. So let's Shift S, switch shader and diffuse. And so let's just mix this with a white diffuse. Shader, mix shader. As you can see, our Fresnel is looking a little bit high, so let's turn that down. So we want just the edges to be mixed with the diffuse, and that'll give us a nice sort of light rim around the edges here. And that's looking pretty good. However, it would look a lot better if we actually had some bump, and that'll make it look a lot more cloth-like. So let's take this image texture here, duplicate it down, change this from color to non-color data, and plug that right into the displacement. And so you can see that's going to add our nice bump, and we can control how strong that is with a brightness contrast node. Alright, that's looking good. So now we have our nice looking scarf. You can add a new material to these as well, these little hairs. However, I can just use the regular scarf. And since it's not actually UV mapped, it looks like it won't take any colors. So let's just really quick U and unwrap that and see what it picked. Oh, that's right. Oh, because they're broken up. So let's try in the particle tab to go down here under Zygos hair rendering. Instead of line segments, let's choose curve segments. Okay, so that filled in those gaps, but it's still not helping with the subsurface scattering. So let's make this just a scarf 01 and change that to a diffuse. So Shift S, shader, and diffuse. Okay, there we go. So now we have almost all of our materials. We just have the wood for the arms and the cloth for the hat. And these are very similar, so I'm going to pretty much just speed through them. The arms are pretty much a simple diffuse. I added a little bit of Fresnel, but not too much. Let's just add an image texture. I found a nice wooden bark one. Want to make sure there's lots of different colors, and it doesn't look too much like tree bark exactly, because if it does, then it'll look a little bit funny because it's such a small scale, and you'll automatically know what scale tree bark should be at. So as long as you add something that you can't really tell how big it is, it should work pretty well. So let's make this a generated texture coordinate. Set this to box mapping. Add a little bit of blend, and that's pretty much all I did. Let's name this to stick. Oh, also, of course, we need to add a little bit of bump. So let's generate that. Change this from color to non-color data. Stick that into the displacement. And turn the value down to something like 0.1. There we go, here's our stick texture. Lastly, let's do the hat really quick. So let's take the hat, add a new texture, hat, take the diffuse, Shift S, shader, subsurface scattering. I want to make this a nice gray. Now I'm going to mix this with a glossy. Just add a little bit of Fresnel. Let's turn this up to something more reasonable, like 0.3, so it's nice and soft. Input, layer weight. And we don't want too much Fresnel, so let's turn that down to about 0.1. That's looking pretty good. And we can also add that texture that we had for the scarf. Texture, image texture. Choose that cloth texture right there. And it looks like we're going to need to add a generated texture coordinate for that as well. So I won't really be able to tell if it's just sort of generated or not. So let's add some box mapping. Plug that into the displacement. And if we look a little bit closer, let's see how it goes. Looks pretty nice, but we should probably turn that down just a bit. So take that down to 0.5. And there we have a nice material for our hat as well. So that is it for making a snowman. I know that was fairly simple, but it was a lot of fun for me to make, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Let's render out a final image just to see exactly what it looks like with all the displacement and stuff, and I'll be back in just a second. Alright, so this is what our little guy looks like right now. I think if I had to make a couple changes, I would pull this eye out a little bit and increase the subsurface scattering. So let's do that really quick. Increase the scale to, say, like 0.5 for the snow, and pull this eye out just a little bit so it's not stuck in there. Once that's done, then we should be good to go. Thanks so much for watching this. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas with your family. And the file for the project that I had, you can find on my website, blunderhd.com. You can find a link to that in the description below. So remember that I'm trying to recreate something that took me hours to make in the span of like 30 minutes, so it's not going to be exactly the same. There's a lot of little tweaks in that file that you can find that make it a little bit more interesting. However, all of the major techniques I explained in this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. I'll see you in the next one.